Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first LinkedIn Live of 2026. I think that is the first time I've said 2026, actually. That feels a bit weird. I am absolutely delighted to welcome back Chris Kim from Palo Alto Networks. And Chris, we were just trying to work that out, weren't we, before? It was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, we
That's
reckon.
right. Yeah, still there.
Yeah, and honestly, a lot has changed, right? So, we're going to be talking about authentic advocacy, how that connects to executive leadership, and especially in an era of AI, which 3 or 4 years ago was not as commonplace as it is today. So, great to have you back, Chris.
Yeah, thanks
Fantastic.
so much, Sarah. Honored to be the first guest of the new year. And as you mentioned, yeah, so much to talk about in this area just over the last few years. So yeah, excited to get into it.
Fantastic. And as always, I have a list of questions to work through, but this is a live chance for you to ask real experts, real practitioners that are in the field doing this. Use the comments. I'm keeping an eye on the comments. Just pop your questions to Chris as we go. And if you're listening to the podcast, you won't be able to do that, obviously, because you're listening to this as a recording. But, make sure you come to the next live session. So, to kick off, Chris, I can't remember where we met. Was it Hitachi where we first met? I think it might have been
Probably in person it was at Hitachi, but it might have been at SAP where we might have like virtually met because we both have
virtually met.
that common background again. But Hitachi was, I think,
So
the first time when I met you in person
yeah,
it was
I
in
think
Europe
so. Yeah.
somewhere. I remember.
It's going back a few years. So
Yeah.
I think at this point, because you have a lot of experience across a lot of global brands. So do you want to give our audience just a bit of an overview of who you are and what you do at Palo Alto Networks, but also the background that you bring to this role?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm currently on the social media team at Palo Alto Networks, doing a lot of kind of strategy work, but also owning our employee advocacy program, getting that kind of refreshed, and a bunch of other different initiatives. And as you mentioned, I've worked at a few different places over my career. So places like SAP, Hitachi, Workday, let's see, ServiceNow, and then over the last few years, I've been in the startup area, so working at companies like Airtable, and most recently, before Palo Alto, I was at Writer, which is an AI startup, and so it's been really fascinating to kind of see all those different, those companies and how they approach social. Obviously, the evolution of advocacy throughout the years, and so, even though most of my career has been in sort of the B2B space, um, I've been fortunate to see a lot of different kind of ways that it's been approached and implemented. And so, yeah, excited to share some of those insights and learnings and also where I think it might be headed.
Fantastic. Well, we are going to explore that. So I'm curious, right? So given that you've had this experience at Workday, at ServiceNow, Palo Alto Networks, Hitachi, what does a strong advocacy program look like in your view, in your eyes?
Yeah, I think really simply, and it's pretty high level, but it is to think in a very integrated, holistic way. I think, one of the phrases that you mentioned the last time we spoke was this notion that the tool is not the strategy, right? And so, a lot of times, especially years ago, when people started to think about like this notion of employee advocacy, a lot of times it started with the implementation of a third-party tool, right? Um, you know, very simple, you kind of business value, pre-curated information, all your whole company can get in there, share it very easily. That's great, but it is a tool, and I think what employee advocacy really is when you really want to think about maximizing value out of it, but also just having a better strategic understanding, is that is just one piece of an advocacy program or a strategy. Now you have things like executive social, sales enablement, even how you interact on social media. It's not just about posting; it's about how you engage in comments, how you join conversations, how you listen, how you take that feedback. So everything about advocacy really needs to be taken to a more holistic level, and so your program should reflect that. So just the idea of just kind of like deploying a tool and having employees have at it, that's great. And if you're executing that well, that's fantastic. But I think that's just one pillar of the overall strategy, and I'm sure we'll get into kind of the other aspects of it. But I think that's kind of the thing to keep in mind is to really think in a very integrated way, because
Oh,
advocacy is so social has always kind of like had many tentacles and reaches across the company, but I think this notion of advocacy has really followed suit, and now again, it's top of mind because it's hitting the CEO's office. There's so many layers to this now, other than just
mm.
the amplification.
So this is music to my ears because this is the drum I've been beating since the start. And I think social in silos will only get you so far. When you've got social selling in one bucket, executive activation in another bucket, advocacy in another bucket, talent as well, talent
Right.
branding in another
Sure.
bucket. But if these programs aren't working holistically and together, you're just going to have stifled impact.
Yeah.
So it's brilliant that you are already talking about this. Before we came on, you talked a little bit about executive activation and how your role looks at that as well.
Mhm.
So can you tell me how that's evolved then to include this executive program and how you connect the two?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it is fascinating. So I think even probably 3 or 4 years ago, exec social was something that some companies dabbled in. It was more of sort of a nice to have, or let's test this and see how it works. Now it's really evolved into a must have.
Yeah.
Every company, I think, every large company, or even a startup that's in an innovative field, their executives are out there. And so whether that is a dedicated exec comms team or that's just a CEO at a startup, posting on their own, this has now become really table stakes. And so that needs to be just like anything else. You need to have a plan around it. You need to understand it. You need to be intentional about how you are how you're engaging, and then again having that wider lens into just the fuller impact that you have as a voice. So again, it's not just about posting, when you make a big announcement or when you have a hot take on something. It's how you engage in between those moments and build not only trust and authenticity and authority, but how do you start to build that community? And then
Mm,
once you get that, then that really leads to business value, right? And so kind of then thinking about the next step, which is trust. These are all kind of buzzwords we've used over the years, but that really does, when you dig into the specifics of it, really leads to business value that impacts your KPIs and your bottom line.
So I'm going to drill into that a little bit. Is how do you sell that to an executive? How do you demonstrate the value so they get it and understand the value of what they're doing and keep at it?
Yeah, for sure. So I always look at it as both sort of quantitative and qualitative lens, right? So on the
Mm,
quantitative side, you can always kind of like there are just sort of big numbers out there that if they don't really understand the notion of like getting your employees or getting your advocates activated, there's tons of industry data that shows how employee content gets 5x the amount of engagement as brand content, brand posted content, things like that. Or if you aggregate the followers of all your employees, it is 10x the size of your brand followers, things like that. So at a very very high level, that can really get somebody's attention. But I think to really have them understand it is to think more about the qualitative, wins and those points. And those are things like, hey, there's a prospect I've been trying to break into for months, and lo and behold, this person from this company has commented on one of my posts, right? Or they're engaging in some way. Or
yeah.
hey, I contributed on this interesting conversation on LinkedIn on somebody else's post who I don't even know, and I added some of my thoughts, and wow, and now I have 3 new connections, who are going to be really valuable for me. So thinking about that, those are anecdotal in a sense, but those actually can add up really quickly. And I think just a general rule with like leadership presentation is the big numbers are great, but the storytelling which comes through
Mm,
these insights and the qualitative insights, that's what makes the key points stick in their mind, right? We just resonate more with stories and specific examples.
yeah.
And there's so many that you can think about when you think about employee or executive engagement or just being out there in the conversation.
Yeah, there's something there's a few words that you've mentioned there about building authority, building community, establishing trust. And I think there's a mindset shift that needs to happen in executives' minds. This is not a campaign, it's not a
Right.
stop start, it's not a, you're going to get this many leads from this many posts, and it's that mindset adjustment. Some of the data that we've been finding actually working with executives is that when executives show up and just talk brand, it impacts follower growth, it impacts engagement rate. I think that also that education around showing us up as human, so to talk about content strategy. And I love the bit where you talked about this isn't just about showing up and posting. this,
Right.
this is as much about engaging in the right spots at the right time, connecting to the right people to help open doors for sales. It's a connected holistic program. Yeah, I
Yeah,
love
for
that.
sure. It's terms we've used thrown around for years like authenticity and trust, and those were probably like overused terms back in the day, but now those have real meaning. You can really
Yeah.
assign actual action and examples to what that actually means.
So tell me a little bit more about that, because there'll be a lot of people maybe listening to this on the podcast or watching today that'll be, I'm trying to get my execs active, but they're
Mhm.
just not shifting. They don't see the value. How do you must have in all your career come across that a few times. So how
Sure.
do you
Yeah.
overcome that initial hump, and then how do you keep them engaged? To a
Right.
reluctant.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And obviously every leadership team is has their own kind of objectives and motivations and things like that. So, you do want to kind of customize it, but there are, approaches that I've taken in the past, which is, especially at a CXO level, is, one thing is like, what are your peers doing? So if you can show them, hey, your three top competitors, CEOs, are out there and they're commenting on, industry trends, and they're getting this level of engagement, that's actually very tangible, right? And they're speaking at these conferences because they're engaging, or they're building relationships, and they're chit chatting with industry analysts and media and things like that. Those are, again, like, to that point, like, those are qualitative examples that can get somebody's attention for sure. So things like that. And then having them, a lot of times if somebody's really reluctant, I try to do a little bit of investigation, and have them just post on something they're passionate about, and it may not even have to be specific to business, but to give them sort of an in into looking at what kinds of conversations are happening on social. So again, if you can connect it to something they're really passionate about, they can really start to internalize. This is what community means. This is what a real back and forth means. Even if they don't participate directly, they can start to get that understanding, and then that might get their toes in the water a little bit. And then in terms of keeping up that habit, a lot of it is um, you might start with very kind of no-brainer activities. They're speaking at a conference, or maybe they're going to visit 10 customers. I always use that as an example. I'm like, hey, if you're going on a customer tour and say you're talking to 20 customers in the next 2 weeks, that's a really unique insight that nobody else has. That could be fodder for a LinkedIn article of some kind, right? Or you're keynoting a conference. That content and those points of views are already being built. That could be the basis of a video that you do, or another piece of content that you write. So, and that's where that partnership with an exec comms team, or whoever is kind of helping to handle and manage those big moments, can help them kind of get not only get started, but keep a little bit of a momentum. Because if you're
Yeah.
CXO at a big company, you've always got speaking engagements, you're talking to customers, you've always got kind of big insightful moments that you can leverage, instead of
Yeah.
thinking of it as like a one-off.
I love that, because what you're doing here is you're teaching them what it means to build community, and you're also supporting them with storytelling techniques, which is, hey, 20 customer meetings, unique insight, that's a post, or
Yeah,
keynote speech, that's a post. It's getting them to notice, I think, to the point where they can just manage it themselves and
yeah,
fly alone.
yeah, and it's reinforcing things they're already doing, because they're
Yeah.
already doing this if they got an exec comms platform, yeah, they've already got this customer trip plan. They're already speaking at this event, so it's not considered us like, oh gosh, I got to start from scratch and do
Yeah.
this whole thing. It's
Yeah.
almost part of that. It's part of that plan and part of that execution.
Fantastic. And just a reminder, anybody who wants to leave any comments or questions or anything like that, please do so. Otherwise, I'm going to be working through all my questions. This is brilliant, Chris. Thank you. I want to bring this back to advocacy, though. How do you see executive activation
Mhm.
impacting wider employee activation? Do you see a relationship between that?
Oh, for sure. And I think this has probably been the case, for years, but leadership, it always starts from the top, right? So if a company sees their leaders out there engaging, sharing their points of view, that only encourages others and sets a tone, and sets a cultural tone internally, that, hey, yeah, this is great. I can also be an advocate for my company. And so, this is less of case now than I would say maybe 10 years ago, where a lot of people were just afraid. They're like, I'm afraid to say anything. I don't want to break any rules, things like that. That still exists, to some degree, but I think, maybe it's not as fearful an environment now, because it's social media is just so, so common. But there, of course, obviously, is you want to set a good tone, and your leadership, always does that. And so, we always have, when our executive posts, we've got a Slack channel. We post that, for employees that they can engage with or read. And then those posts get then distributed through internal newsletters and things like that. And so, again, it's just part of that kind of good hygiene and building good habits, right? Um,
So that's interesting. So can you tell me a little bit more about the internal mechanics then? Because it
yeah,
sounds like you're not just working with the execs in isolation, you're joining that up to internal platforms like Slack,
yeah.
newsletters. So that's quite interesting. So are you doing that? Are you working with your internal comms team? How is that connected? Because that's super important.
Yeah, that's, I would say, maybe another change from the last few years is that there is so much, maybe it's because I work, in tech, but we use Slack all the time, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and so having that as, official channels, but also just, informal channels to distribute information, is huge. And I think, you know, in my case, it's not something I can say I have like totally got my hands around, because again, it is a mix of like informal plus formal. But there are things. So for example, I work with our sales enablement team, and every week they put out an internal newsletter with the latest company news. Um, but then they also mimic that on a Slack channel. So every week I give them, here are our top 3 stories, that we posted on social, and here are the links to them that they can easily share it. And so that goes into our newsletter. That also goes into their Slack channel. And I think that um, a key learning is that it's best if you can really um, incorporate into an existing communication channel, right? Instead of trying to build your own. Sometimes it makes sense, and I actually will be building kind of a dedicated Slack channel soon. But obviously, for like enablement and just the effectiveness of getting the information out, identifying what are those existing channels that you can tie into, especially with sales, right? Because they always have newsletters, weekly calls, monthly calls, boot camp, things like that. And so there's plenty of potential touch points there to leverage.
Yeah.
Same with execs, same with your recruiting team, all of kind of like a lot of your key audiences within a company.
Right. I'm going to come back to recruiting, but I
Yeah.
want to dig into something and skip forward a little bit about what you said about fear. So I've got my little pen here. Um, so my B pens, my daughter's. AI. Right. I really want to talk about AI because that
Oh,
didn't exist. I'm building a little list of from the last time that we spoke, how
yeah.
everything's changed: fear, internal comms, execs, AI. So this, I, it's a big topic, but the fear word came to me because I wonder whether AI has just opened the floodgates to people creating content for LinkedIn that may not be brand approved, or it may be a bit bland, or it may be just noise.
Yeah.
Um, Give me your thoughts about AI and its impact on advocacy.
Yeah. So we're at that stage of AI where like, everybody's using it. There's a ton of noise out there for sure. Call it AI slop, whatever you want to. And so I think we are at that point where, there is a lot of noise out there. And you have to deal with that. But I also think that's an opportunity, because it does then make those really impactful. And again, that word authentic. You can see a really well written post with real insights. Those will shine through even more. Um, so I think there's still an opportunity there. In the meantime, I think that, yeah, there is just a lot of kind of, maybe bland, not so, impactful content out there. But that's not to say that AI is not important. Like, we use it all the time. I came from an AI company called Writer, for goodness sake, and and we used it, of course. But that startup, we also had content people. We didn't just outsource all of our writing and all of our content to our platform. We still have a head of content. We still have dedicated writers to to create really compelling stories. AI is very helpful for a lot of things, obviously, whether it's brainstorming or just ideation, or um, summarizing or synthesizing information. So for sure, that's something that we're going to use every day. But I think we're kind of in this stage right now where people are trying to figure out what is the best use of it, the most effective use of it. In the meantime, there's just going to be a lot of just noise out there. But again,
Yeah.
I think that is an opportunity for those real voices to stand out. Our CEO at my last company, her post got probably 10x the engagement of our corporate posts.
Wow.
She had very strong, very unique opinions in AI, which is the noisiest space of all. But
Yeah.
to her credit, and the other executives there, they always made sure to have a really genuine take on certain things. And but we might do just some ideation. We might do a first draft or something like that, or just get some information to help inform that piece of content. But
Yeah.
the core of it, the heart of it, is still coming from that individual creator.
Yeah, yeah. AI not for thinking, but AI for consult. I agree with you. I mean, AI is a massive opportunity, especially for individuals where English might not be their first language, or if they have accessibility issues. Like my daughter who's dyslexic, she struggles to write,
Yeah,
and this helps it get it out of her head and into something that she can share. So I do see the opportunity as well. So I think it's great. Um,
yeah, or things like I remember talking to the person who managed our blog, and one of the use cases that she used AI for was like, how do I take this very technical piece of content? I need to think of like an analogy or a metaphor, that can translate it to something more non-technical. Give me some examples, like of an analogy or a metaphor that might help me translate it. So things
Fantastic.
like that to kind of unlock your brain on some of these things. We all get writer's block. We all kind of get stuck, and so AI can be great for, if nothing else, just giving you something to react to right on the screen.
Fantastic. That's a great idea. I'm going to steal that. It's a brilliant idea. Thank you for sharing, Chris. Right, coming back to your advocacy program, and I want to talk about future as well
Sure.
later, but you talk about the term social ambassadors. Now, I've heard people call brand ambassadors, brand
Yeah.
advocates, talent advocates. Who are they? How do you select them?
Hmm.
And how do you keep them? How do you keep them committed to the program?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's an interesting way to look at it, and you're right. The term itself is not as important as like what it means. Because yeah, you can call it ambassador, you can call it whatever you want. I guess the way I kind of think about it is, everyone at a company can be an advocate in a certain way. The day you start your new job, you update your LinkedIn profile. You're being an advocate. That update gets put out to your network. You're advocating for your brand on day one, right? Being an ambassador, or kind of taking it to that next level, to me is people who think about, how can I use this skill or social media to embed this into my daily work to really help achieve my objectives within my job, versus just being like, oh, this is a great announcement, I'm going to share this out, which is obviously great as well. But how do I really get the most and really impact my how I do my job. And so to me, that's sort of that next level, what you might want to call ambassador. Now, the way that I identify these people is I try to there's different ways to think about it. So there's like, if you're an executive or a subject matter expert and you are kind of out there, to me, that's an opportunity for ambassadorship because you have a unique point of view, you have an expertise. That's somebody who I might proactively reach out to, right? Um,
Yeah.
so there's that, but then there are hand raisers who are just, hey, I'm really passionate about this. I've seen it be really impactful for my job, or I'm just curious about learning more. Um, you know, how can I be better at this? And it doesn't matter if you have 100 followers or 5,000 followers. To me, you can be an ambassador if you have that curiosity and the willingness to think about how you want to embed this. And so, how I'm trying to organize all this, at least like right now, for example, at Palo Alto Networks, is I mentioned before I'm going to be starting a new Slack channel, and I'll probably call it something like Social Ambassadors. But I want to be able to have a place where all of these folks can gather informally. It doesn't have to be something that people use every day, but a place where we can have deeper conversations about using social. It could be social selling, social recruiting, or it could just be just as important as just people sharing their experiences. Oh, this worked for me. I'm a BDR, and this is what I did on LinkedIn, and gosh, I got 3 new potential leads from it. That kind of thing. So creating a space, a dedicated space for ambassadors to talk to each other and share, and I'll be providing resources and sparking conversations and things like that. So like the way I'm trying to recruit them is I'm looking at who are our top users in our advocacy tool as kind of a no-brainer, like who's really already out there. People, subject matter experts who I've seen out there on social media. I'll proactively reach out and be like, hey, we've got this new, kind of virtual, group that we're getting set up. And then, as we communicate it out, then hopefully I get those hand raisers who know about it, like, oh, I'm curious, like, what's going on, what can I learn more about this. So I'm trying to do like a combination of kind of proactive outreach, but also letting people know about it so they can raise their hand and join. And so
So
I'm excited about it. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, this is really cool because what you've touched on there is different roles. Okay, so you
Yeah,
didn't just say our ambassadors are our technical experts,
right.
or our ambassadors are sales. You've touched on BDRs. It could be a talent brand
Right.
ambassador. It could be a sales rep, AE. So it's and what I also tuned into is it doesn't matter if you've got 100 followers or 1,000 followers. If you want to be an ambassador, we'll help you, right?
Yeah.
Which is brilliant because some people put gates in, right? It's like, I'm
Yeah.
afraid you've got less than 2,000 people in your network, you can't be there. But this is cool. So can you talk to me a little bit about that role definition, and does what you provide in terms of enablement change depending on which role they're in?
Yeah, so this is a kind of another aspect of kind of a programmatic approach that I do think about it in terms of like enablement and kind of training and things like that. I think about it in terms of, well, first of all, I'm going to build sort of a 101 level for everybody, right? So we're all kind of on a base level, and that could be training and resources and tools and all of that. And maybe that's something that's just available to all employees, right? But then as the next step, what I will do is I will reach out to specific teams who are, and I usually start with like the customer facing teams or the public facing teams, as we've talked about, sales, recruiting, marketing, and I will do team specific content and training for them. So this is where we start getting into social selling, right, for sales teams, social recruiting for your recruiters, and then your subject matter experts might be like another leg of that because obviously they're trying to build their personal brand, build their authority, and then executives, could be another workflow because then that's now you're going into sort of exec comms world. But yeah, that's sort of like a pretty typical way that I think about it. Obviously, sales uh, there's a lot that they tend to use social media quite a bit, so they require a lot of sort of can benefit from a lot of guidance and best practices, and that's another reason why the Slack group and things like that are great because I found that like I can go in and do a quarterly training to a sales team, and we can post it up on a portal, and they can see it async and things like that. For me, the best value from those meetings is when I get them talking to each other, right?
Yeah,
And they learn from each other. And
yeah,
that's where I think that's where again the lessons stick, and where I learn as well. And so that's where kind of whether it's a Slack channel or some other kind of ongoing the little digital community where they can share from each other. Oh, this worked for me. I wrote this. I sent it to prospects, and this hook worked really well for our
yeah.
company. So getting them to learn from each other, and then they come from other companies, right? So then they take their best practices that they've learned from other companies. And so to me, that's where I get the most reward. It's not from me teaching them; it's from them teaching each other.
I think that's such an important point, Chris. We came back from a sales kickoff for a customer last week, running a series of workshops. And what felt great compared to when we were there last year is that this year there were a ton of stories from
Mm,
AEs and BDRs. They learn from each other. At some point in a program, you have to become the facilitator, bubbling up the stories, the qualitative case studies, the meetings booked, the pipeline increase. That they listen to their peers more than they'll listen to the
for
trainer.
sure. Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
and
the
it's
key.
just a lot of times it's just creating that space for
Yeah,
them to talk to each other. And if you
yeah,
can do that in an ongoing way, they don't have to talk to each other every day, but just have them having a place to share. Oh yeah, this worked great, or I have a question about this, or has anyone encountered this scenario?
yeah.
Um, to me, those are just such awesome moments, right?
Yeah, it does feel good and it works. I love that.
Yeah.
Um, Now, in a previous conversation, you mentioned you've got like a dedicated designer of some kind that sort of works alongside. Can you tell me a bit about that then and how that facilitates and supports the advocacy program?
Yeah, so this is like to me it's like a luxury. I've never really had a dedicated designer in my roles. It's always I've worked with great designers for sure, but you're usually sort of like taking part of somebody's time, or it's a little bit of agency. It's never kind of basically full time. Hey, you're working with our team. You're really part of our
Mm,
team, and so that has really been a game changer, right? Because you can not only just turn on things quickly, but you have a partner in creativity and brainstorming, and that's great. That just benefits the entire social media program, because not only does the work you put on kind of your corporate channels, does that really sing and that really improves, because you have somebody who understands not only your brand but how it should show up on the different social media platforms, whether it's LinkedIn or Instagram, etc. But then what we do a lot of times is then that can then either be leveraged for employees as well, or in the design process or the planning process, we'll say, hey, let's create a version for employees, or maybe
mm,
even a version for executives and employees if it's like a big announcement, for example. And so
oh,
having
yeah,
that dedicated resource, not just for kind of that person to gain the expertise and for the partnership, but we totally leverage it for our employee advocacy program. And I use it as sort of a hook to get people to use our tool. As I mentioned in the beginning, the tool can be, really useful for certain things. And one of the great things is like, hey, if you go to our advocacy tool, you can use this incredible creative that we've designed. It's not just going to be like the hero image from the blog post, or
yeah.
a 30-second cut from a video that it obviously was not social optimized. Like all the creative, all the visuals and and videos, those are all social first, and you can benefit from that just by going to the tool. And so that's, to me,
Mm,
that's how the designer expertise and how that feeds into an advocacy program. It's I wish I had that at my other jobs, because otherwise you're putting in a link to an article and it just pulls your default image
yeah,
and things like that. And but now, like, pretty much every one of our posts has some sort of social first graphic, which is, I
that's
know it's a luxury,
amazing.
but it's really a pretty amazing thing.
Well, I love what you're doing there because you're using that as a bit of a magnet to use the tool. It's like if you want to
Exactly.
look different, right? If you want to
Yeah.
look like everyone else with one of those links with just a thin, but if you want to look different, we have the creative. We've built it for social,
Yeah.
but you can only get access to that through the platform.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think we
Yeah,
do some pretty fun stuff, in our space. And people notice that. So they're like, oh, cool. That was a great little, you know, whatever. That was a great little video you guys did, or a great, cool little, looping GIF of some kind.
yeah.
And yeah, you can use that exact piece of creative for yourself. So
Yeah, fantastic. That is such a great tip. I haven't heard that before actually. So that's
yeah,
really good. I've heard it for corporate channels, but not for
right.
as a way of driving employee advocacy excitement through the platform. It's a great idea.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And again, you don't have to have a full-time designer, but if you have somebody who, is building social first creative for you, then
Yeah.
it's a kind of a no-brainer for the next step to make sure that it's, you know, leveraged and built for your advocacy platform.
Fantastic. Fantastic, Chris. Right. So we're coming to the close, right? And I've got a couple of things that I just want to ask. First, I've got to ask, how are you measuring all of this? Because last time we spoke, it was a lot of impressions and media value, clicks,
Right,
that.
right, right.
Where are you at today? Are you going beyond likes? Are you looking at
Yeah,
business
yeah.
metrics?
I mean, at a very, very high level, you are looking at sort of impressions and things like that. Just at the very high level, is this going up? Is this going down? That kind of thing. But as I've talked about before, I've really tried to bring in that qualitative aspect almost on equal footing, because it should be supporting the quantitative metrics that you have. So if you're presenting to leadership, you'll have those big numbers out there, but then you'll have the example that supports it. And again, like I said, I think leaders, they remember the stories, the individual stories, and
Mm,
they'll remember, like, whether this thing is a green light, a green arrow, or red, or yellow. But oh, that post or that person's comment, oh, that thing led to a sales meeting. Wow, those are the things that are going to stick. So I try to bring those up, especially when you're presenting. I
yeah,
bring those out to reinforce the overall story that you're trying to tell. And then for executives, I've built specific kind of KPI goals for specific executives as
yeah,
well. And again, I try not to focus on, like, follower growth or things like that. But it could just be like, hey, I want to see if I can get let's accelerate 5 deals, this quarter, or whatever it is.
yeah,
Um, and sometimes it's just you have to test and learn a little bit. So if they're getting a lot of prospects engaging, and you see those wins, then that's maybe something you try to double down on, and then you build a KPI around something like that.
yeah.
So they start as qualitative, but you can actually create a little mini KPI for those teams as well.
Yeah, but I totally agree with you. You've got to bring this back to business impact, especially when
Mhm.
talking to execs.
Yeah,
This cannot just be a nice to have and a PR exercise.
yeah,
Execs will do it if it helps the business grow, right? So if
yeah.
you can tie it back to that, then that's where the impact is had. These analysts engage with your posts. This
Totally.
opens doors for
Yeah.
your sales teams to get conversations.
Yep, for sure. And I mean, what I found is, and maybe it is, I've worked at bigger, B2B tech companies or more high profile. You can find a lot of those types of examples.
Yeah,
It's not just a one-off kind of thing, but you can, yeah, if they do it to some level of consistency, you're almost always going to find something really interesting, a person you connected with that you would not have otherwise, or somebody from a prospect who might not even be in your CRM, who's engaged with you. Like, those are huge. And it's in B2B, like, if you get one really interesting lead, that can make all the difference, right? So
yeah,
it's not like you
yeah,
need necessarily 100 examples. I have examples from other companies where it's like, these 5 prospects who we've never been able to break into, because we posted and because they commented, and we're able to listen, and we found them, we're able to make a connection. A lot of times, like, I'll see something from a prospect because I have access to our CRM, and if I don't see them in our CRM and they're maybe a strategic account, I'll just ping the AE and be like, hey, did you know this person engaged or commented? And again, this is like one of these awesome, just prideful moments. One of the happiest moments I get in my job is when I can make that connection. They're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea, and we have a meeting next week with them. This will be really helpful. Or yeah, we've been trying to break in for months, and now we have an in. Those are
Yeah.
again, they're qualitative and kind of anecdotal, but again, if it's a big enough account, that makes a huge difference, right?
Yeah, it's the moments that matter, though. I
Yeah,
remember seeing a customer on stage last week who talked about it's those little moments that really matter. Don't underestimate the power of the little moments. And I think as a industry, actually, we're moving away from just the massive creation of numbers and it's all volume. We're moving to moments that matter, those little
yeah,
indications of that shift. So my final question to you, Chris, is that, and you kind of teased at the start of this,
yeah.
which is I've got ideas about where this is going. The future. Where's the future? Chris, you and I have spoken for years. Where do you see this going? How do you think it's changing, emerging, evolving?
Yeah, it is. It's all the things we've talked about, but I think becoming more in focus, and people will figure
Mm.
out. Like a lot of testing right now, and obviously a lot of AI out there. But I think companies and executives and employees will get more uh, just more refined in terms of how they engage versus sort of the more kind of shotgun method we might be seeing now. But what is interesting and was also encouraging is to me like a lot of the fundamental things that worked 10 years ago will still work today, and even more now in the age of AI. Like we just talked about authenticity, right? That is, I think it's really obvious to see a post that's written from somebody
Yeah,
that has real insight versus a more generically written post. And I'm not talking about M dashes and those kinds of flags and things like that, but just you can just read something
the
and
voice.
you kind of know what you just know it when you read it. And so I think you know whatever the platforms and the algorithms are doing, I think having a real voice will always stand out and will always resonate with people. So that gives me encouragement. The platforms again will always keep changing. I hope some of the platforms will start to reveal more analytics, which will help creators and employees. LinkedIn's starting to do that a little bit.
Yeah,
It's kind of like a little bit at a time. So that's going to be interesting. But I think I still think that authentic engagement posting is still going to win out, and
mm,
whatever the algorithms are doing, I think you're still gonna, and whatever the quote best practices are that you think, I still think great content is going to win out. And just one last little point before we wrap that I wanted to make more prominent earlier was that it isn't just about posting, and obviously that's important. But what I've learned, I think, over the last few years, both within companies I've worked at, and also on my own personal profile, is engaging in people's conversations, even if it's a short comment, if it's valuable, not just a great comment, not, if, that makes a huge difference. And a phrase I love to hear is community is in the comments.
yeah,
And when you read the comment section of a LinkedIn post, um, you can see some really interesting dialogue happening. And I started to do that on my own a few years ago because I remember I was like, most of my network is pretty B2B focused. And I was like, I want to meet some more, other people kind of outside of my bubble. And so, I would read and contribute to various conversations. And I wouldn't force it, but it would be like, oh, I have maybe an interesting take on this. And it would just be a short little comment. But I gained so many new connections and built new relationships just from that activity and just being intentional about it. So I always try to encourage employees and executives, like, don't sleep on just commenting and participating in conversations, because there's
yeah,
a ton of value. And again, if you're doing it if it comes from a very genuine space, it's like, hey, I have a real take on this, that would contribute to this thread that's happening. I think that's an underrated thing right now for anybody, and so I'm always encourage it for people to
yeah.
do.
I think that's such an important point, Chris, because what you're talking about there is being intentional about broadening your scope, because it's very easy to get sucked into a bubble. And the algorithms gear it up, right? You like one post on any social platform, it's going to feed you a ton of others that reinforce that. So being intentional, being aware for a start, which is great, and then being
Mhm.
intentional about broadening your perspective. And I think that's a great strategy. And also, just on the point about when you said, it's quite obvious when you can see somebody's not written a post. I think authentic voice, and I know it sounds a bit cliche, but people know if that sounds like you or if it doesn't, right?
Right.
And
Right.
and I think it's dangerous. They won't just wash over it. It might even damage credibility, brand
Mhm.
credibility, your professional credibility. And this is
Yeah.
why I think exec voices need to be so careful. You can't just outsource this to the PR agency. This needs to be real storytelling through real voice. So yeah, I just think that was cool.
Yeah.
I love talking to you, Chris. I could talk to you for the whole hour, but I'm going to have to wrap it
Likewise.
up. But it's just so insightful. And given that we haven't connected for a few years, I just think it's been brilliant to go over and go, oh, yeah, that's changed. The fear is still there, but it's slightly different. Connecting with internal comms, building a holistic executive presence is a must have, not a nice to have.
Yeah.
AI's changed everything, and the future is focus, right? So, and that's going to be everything within a company, all
Mm.
focusing on the same thing, being
Yeah.
intentional.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
It's always awesome to talk to you, and I learn just as much from these conversations. So yeah, always great chat with you, Sarah.
Super. Thank you so much, Chris. And anybody who wants to connect with Chris, you can find him on LinkedIn, Chris Kim at Palo Alto Networks. Feel free to connect to him, reach out if you've got any other questions. But thank you once again, Chris. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay. Bye bye.